but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending,
Goethe.
I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
I just don't want to. No, don't change.
No. You're
10 books.
changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
Okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
It's not a book.
Twilight
I
series.
want the name.
It is a book.
Reading makes you sick, and reading makes you die!
Do you like that new edited intro?
It's so good.
That was a chunk that I kept from an AI track, one of several that I produced for Do You Even Read? And I got like 7 of these, and that was the one part that I loved. Reading makes you sick, and reading
What
makes
did you
die.
prompt it for? Give me a Parentera song that promotes illiteracy.
I wanted to see what it came up with, and that's why I had so many. I wanted to see like what would throw at me, and I got very specific with the later ones. But it just came up with that. I don't even like it. Wouldn't be. It's kind of like it's like rock punk. It sounds like Treble Charger to me, which is probably not a reference most people would get. But like it's punk rock made by a guy who's very audibly 45 years old.
This is a guy who, instead of buying the Porsche at 45 for his midlife crisis, he says, I'm starting a band.
I can't wait to get a midlife crisis. It's coming for me. It'll come for you too, but I feel it.
I'm looking forward to it.
It's hard to have a midlife crisis when you're broke.
No, that's when you get into like a really niche hobby.
Because you hear stories like,
You're like, I'm going to get into wood carving. I'm going to buy some 2x4s. I'm going to go build a shed. And then it's just like, well, I don't see. What do you do now in Canada with a midlife crisis? Because it's just like, well, if you have one, like there's an option to take your way out.
Well, because you hear about these midlife crises from the 80s, which is the mythology it was based off of. It's like, oh, he's having a midlife crisis. He bought a Triumph motorcycle and a Ferrari. What the fuck are you talking about? He just had people had Ferrari.
Well, just remember,
money
he
sitting
bought his
around.
house for a year's salary.
He's
got money to burn.
He bought his house for a pet website and a pat on the back. That's what you used to be able to do back then.
All you had to do was just, with a couple of AOL America Online 500-minute CDs, you could own a house in 1995.
These days, I can't even slaughter my way to get my soul back. So we got an idea here. Birdhouses. John Gores is saying.
That is literally what my dad has started doing in his mid 50s. I mean, my father has land. My father takes care of the land for his like ag exemption, but he makes birdhouses. And I guess it paid off for him because he sent me a text the other day. He's like, hey, I've got a bluebird in here and it's got eggs inside. And he sent me the photo of the eggs and the little, birdhouse and the nest that was made. And I was like, that's really cool, Dad. And he's like, yeah, I'm really proud of this one. And I'm like, I hope I understand his joy when I'm his age. Cause to me, I'm just like, I'm not feeling it, man. I'm not.
2 questions spring to the fore. As your land holdings increase, so too does the size of the birdhouse. Like you're just building a house. There must be so many birds that you're responsible for.
I like to think of him as it's like Section 8 housing, but for birds.
It's funny if it's just a bird man house. There's a bird man living on your property.
It's just, Harvey Birdman lives there now. Harvey Birdman's my dad. I probably should have disclosed that at the beginning of the series that I'm related to the Harvey Birdman. And then it was really cool. I got to meet Michael Keaton for 5 minutes.
So my dad's building a Harvey Birdman house, and he is not well.
You have no idea how much stress my dad is under. He's worried he's going to get sued by a senile old fuck with wings.
Every man has an ideal amount of acreage of land that they can hold dominion over. Your dad simply has too much land, and
I wish.
too many hectares, and it starts to rot away at the mind and the soul, the skin, the flesh. I mean, that's going to be me when I'm old. I want to own a lot of land. I can't wait to be a curmudgeon, frankly. I hate being the age I'm at right now. I would rather be 19 or 62. Anything in between is just a great big fucking foolish wash to me.
Aren't you a father and a loving husband?
Wouldn't it be great just to get on the other end of that?
You're like, wouldn't it be nice to be at the beginning when I have new ideas to fuck up my life? Or,
Yeah.
hey, I'd like to be at the tail end of this part where my kids can say hi every 6 months.
Yeah, they're just dropping in. What's dad up to? Some bullshit.
What's dad up to? Oh, he's building an AI startup to replace Indian call centers.
Oh, dad's living his dream of being lonely and weird that he talked about our entire lives.
He's gone back to podcasting ever since mom died.
It's like I love you guys, but I need to go insane. I need to lose my mind. I've seen too much, I've read too much, and you know what? Like
This is why we need a Shadow over Innsmouth or any of the sort of Cthulhu mythos books remade, where it's just a private investigator chud he's too red pilled and he's trying to tell the masses and it just breaks him.
We've just rewritten Transmetropolitan. I don't know if anyone ever read that comic book. Judas will know what I'm talking about because he's read like exactly one comic book, and it's that.
It's good to be back.
Oh fuck! It's turning into a digital archipelago. We need to avert course. I can't just start talking about comics I saw when I was a kid. It is good to be back. We had a month off. Did you have? I know you've told your people. Did you have any updates to bring to the forefront about any big life miracles that happened?
Life miracles. No. So we took February off because I got married and enjoyed all of the stress of planning and executing a wedding and dealing with family and in-laws and things like that and moving into a larger space. So all that's kind of wrapped up, and here we are now at the end of March. We had to reschedule last week for some personal reasons. But yeah, no, it's good to be back, and we've got a monster of a book for you all. So I really hope that you enjoy. We know that Do You Even Read has kind of become the staple. It's the only pro e-literacy podcast in the English-speaking world, and we're really proud of that title. And I think you're really going to enjoy tonight's episode.
Another thing we've been working on, if people noticed during the intro that there was a new image that was gracing your eyes there, and it was based off of merch that we were working on for Do You Even Read. Exciting times. We got it right here. It's the Do You Even Read shirt. It's just a logo we came up with. And
we're very proud of it. It's got all the best memes of the show all in one convenient place at the Good Suffer store.
Yeah, if you look at it, you can see the references. You see spinal catastrophism. You'll see cyclonopedia. You'll see anti-Oedipus, and then there's just a great big hunting knife stabbing a book. There's a lot going on. So this is one of the rare shirts from this space that you could wear outdoors and wear among polite society.
This is a great conversation starter about your love for reading when you go to your local Barnes and Noble and they're hosting some signing from some feminist author talking about her travel log and how she left her husband and now she's ready to go see the world when she writes about muff diving. And instead, we're talking about the real transformation of the world, which is the title of today's book by Jürgen Osterhammel, which has been a really great read for me at times. I think you also equally enjoyed it. And speaking of traveling around the world for muff, boy, oh boy, does this talk about the history of that in its own unique way.
The history of lesbianism, which could very well be a book.
The history of lesbianism written by a German. That's actually the most fitting way I think you could ever write the history of lesbianism.
The history of lesbianism written by a German. It's just the word 9 on every page. It's 1,000 pages of 999. I thought that would get a better one from Prude. Anyway, off to a rough start, I see.
For me, like a lot of German jokes have been ruined by living in Germany as a kid, but also like Craig Ferguson doing all the Kraftwerk parodies when he was on the air. He was the only funny late night TV host, in my personal opinion. Maybe because I was a teenager right when he was getting big as the like late show host, and I really appreciated that kind of stupid humor.
I feel as though I like Conan O'Brien in theory, but perhaps not so much in practice. That's something Jürgen Osterhammel. I might be adding a bit too much stank on the name. I'm trying to impress our German listeners, of course.
All two of them.
This is a phenomenal book. It's well over 1,000 pages, and it was recommended to me by this reading group that I'm a part of. And like many history books, it's extremely dense as well. So it's very long, it's very dense, and you can lose yourself in it.
It's very meta. It's great.
They would meet once a week and spend an hour or two talking about it, and they were covering this book for 6 months. We're going to try and condense it into 2 parts. We probably could go for 3, we can go for 5. But
we might go for 3, but the third will be behind the paywall.
Yeah. There's so many historical examples presented in this book. And so what it seeks to accomplish is a comprehensive world history of the 19th century, which you don't see a lot of. You'll see various histories of the 19th century, but not in the global context. And he makes note of this early in the book. But I found some conceptual through lines. I found some themes. And there's many examples they're given from... I will say this at the start. So when you hear world history, you might be thinking Middle East, Africa, South America. And I would keep in mind that it is still the 19th century. And even if you want to tell a global history, you need to consider who are the global players. So you're going to see a lot of Europe. It takes great strides to not be Eurocentric. And he says this in the beginning, but realistically, you cannot tell the story of the 20th or 19th century without Europe being the center of that, really. However, it talks of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of Japan, which I thought was interesting. Japan and China, you'll see a lot of.
Very fitting, considering what my timeline has been for the last week.
Yeah, exactly. As of today, apparently, like, I didn't know how much Japan loved America. I thought it was just a one-way street. But, Russia, of course, but much of the world is not included because there wasn't much of consequence going on. You might think there was a lot going on in Africa. I'm sure there was regionally, but of anything of global consequence was not occurring. And that's what it is. And he'll speak of South America, but in the context of colonies more or less controlled by European powers. So I would say that the author, I hate saying it, I hate framing it like this because he is a German academic. I don't want to call him a liberal, but this would not be from a right-wing perspective. There's nothing in it that screamed corrupted by ideology. However, he did spend quite a bit of time on capitalism. He spent quite a bit on slavery. And so I've spoke quite a bit now. I wanted to throw...
There are some hot button issues that, in the way, of course, this book has been very popular with a lot of prominent European Union officials, as well as members of the European Parliament that have praised this book and have spoken at great lengths praising it as a better understanding. There are some hot button issues that do get mentioned, primarily a lot very early on the question of immigration. Not just like capital I immigration, but also immigration with an E, refugee and population displacement, and also the cost of conflict, both in terms of ethnic conflict, but also its relationship to how people are displaced or reorganized and recategorized. And Jürgen does a really good job, I think, at breaking that down in a way that this book is very meta in the way that I think a lot of other history books that maybe people read are not, in that he spends a great chunk of time in every section of the book talking about sort of his methodology, where he's coming from, and also the linguistic breakdown for where we get certain terms. For instance, I should have known this, right? But there was... the phrase Latin America really only comes from like Napoleon III and trying to like combine the Romance languages in Europe and France with respects to Mexico and South America. Until then, it had a much different term. And then at the same time, like because he is German, there's references to Koselleck, which we've talked about on the show. The saddle, the saddle time, Sattelzeit is mentioned in here. So I think for a lot of it's a very good understanding of how like a continental academic is going to look at the world. And also he's right, because the 19th century, I'm going to dive into this, Dimes, and I think this is a really great place to start. He spends a chapter and he spends a whole section discussing what is the 19th century in terms of how long it took place. There's the popular concept of course, we have like the calendar century, which is 100 years on the Gregorian Reformed calendar. But also that we know that a lot of people will tell you that the 1990s don't end until like 2010. It's like, or 2005, or they'll pick a certain time frame. I think the 90s ends when Barack Obama gets elected. But like, so he talks about like the concept of like the long century. So for him, he's like the 19th century. You could argue, usually a lot of people say it's 1789 to 1919 when World War I ends. I think it's a very important thing to discuss because in a lot of ways, I don't think the 19th century really ends until World War II is over, because the motivating ideologies and the reaction to the ideologies of the 19th century are fought over the 90s and with 9/11. That's a lot of people make that claim too. But I mean, he kind of breaks that down as well in the book. And it's particularly interesting in the way that for Osterhammel, like he spends a great chunk of change looking at the methodology of how we calculate this. Like, are we just talking about time? But he also kind of goes into it in a Heideggerian way as well. Like, there's a lot of emphasis on space, how much mental space we conceptualize a century to be, how much actual space do we like look at history in regards to like, well, are we just referring to Europe? Are we referring to the Americas? Do we refer to the collective West, the long century? Yeah, that's right. He literally pulls that term up as well. And so it's something that I greatly appreciate, because it's something that you and I, Dimes, have been talking about for years, about how like the political ideology of the 21st century has yet to be written, despite the fact that we're a quarter of a century into the 21st century. I think these kind of meta commentaries, they scratch an itch for me, because this is why I spend so much time writing about media and how it fucks with my brain. Every other Substack essay I write.
Yeah, there's a sense, a pretty pervasive sense that, we're just sort of commoditizing and recommoditizing and, making hyper realities of 20th century, but arguably 19th century models. And we really haven't come up with a mental model or a worldview that can really stand as a consequence of the information revolutions. A lot of people are still locked within the context of the Industrial Revolution. And I think there's a lot of people that are working through something right now. We're in a transitional period. And we talked about this at length on both of our shows, but also on here. And that's why we spent so long talking about historical time. A lot of people don't consider, and he spends the first bit of this book talking about it. And I really appreciated that. And you need that, because you need to talk about, he says, when was the 19th century, but where was it too? What was the center of gravity around which everything rotated? And that is where you end up in Europe, because you're talking about a lot of materialistic revolutions. As we will get to later on, it's sort of the emergence of nationalism. Now, let me just qualify that a little bit. When we say nationalism, if you're a student of nationalist theory, we've covered this in our show as well. I'm thinking of the construction of nationhood by, I believe it was Adrian Hastings. There's a strong argument to be made, especially if you just define a nation as a group of people possessing sufficient self-awareness. Well, the roots of that can go back to medieval Europe. Hell, most tribes can be said to have that. Not all of them, but many of them. So yes, there's an argument to be made that nationalism or proto-nationalism can go back centuries, even millennia, but nationalism as we know it now emerged in the 19th century. And so a lot of the and that's really what this book is about. And if I could just launch with that, I would say that the book argues that pretty much our entire worldview that we have in the 21st century right now was created in the 19th century. And that's everything from how we conceptualize time, how borders were redrawn around then, and we'll get to that into quotes later on. But most importantly, and we'll get to this in just a moment, there's a whole segment I want to read here, but it was like a revolution of self-awareness during this century. And he makes the case that even though the edges of the century are blurred, it is longer, but it's nothing like the Middle Ages. Certain epochs throughout history take place over many centuries. But the 19th century, even though it's got the blurred edges, it actually does kind of fit neatly within the bounds. And that might be, interestingly enough, because we had an emerging conceptualization of centuries. And so we try to block in our innovations by century. Like, that's a weird kind of meta concept. That's like self-awareness guiding our innovations based on somewhat arbitrary timelines, right? But you start seeing that then, and we haven't really left that mental model. Again, it starts off kind of trippy like that too. It's not just a historical account, but it needs to be like, here's how you need to think of this. And he's really just trying to bring all these histories together, histories that were not necessarily overlapping, but you started to see similar things. There's influence, of course, in China, but even China was very resistant to Western influence. And yet there was this technological revolution. There was this sort of bottom-up nationalistic fervor that was taking a different form in different nations, and things happening in Japan. Things were happening at around the same time, even though it wasn't due to any form of imperialist projection. If anything, the argument was made that it was just technological adoption. In China specifically, it was trying to control how literacy was proliferating, but it couldn't really stop it. And there was just this sort of, a revolution of technology that was happening that can't really be stopped. I think even if we're to give some credit to Nick Land, I've had my criticisms of Nick Land before, but one idea that he circles back to is that like this sort of innovation is unstoppable. You can try and control it all you want, but it behaves almost like an egregore, and it proceeds with a mind of its own, and you can resist it, but in resisting it, you'll break all your fucking bones. Like you're just swimming against the current, and then you'll just arrive at the same place broken and mangled. And so you start to get that idea here once you're looking at how all of these separate nations started to not only adopt these technologies but coalesce and form the German unification movement. But all these, he gives a number here. I should probably just start reading it, but it's like, throughout Europe there was, 18th century, it had 115 separate, kingdoms and principalities, and then it ended up with 15 over the course of this 100 years. Like that's a massive mind-bending redrawing of the map that a lot of people don't take into account. It happened pretty fast. I'm just taking a look at the comments here.
Yeah, I mean, like the first few sections here really do take its time and sort of building off of all of the things that you, the audience, and Dimes and I have covered or have read for years, which is, we've talked about conceptual history recently on the show. We've talked about Harold Innis and imperial communications separately and together, as well as the impact of acceleration, which is basically the whole book that kind of got the show started with spinal catastrophism. And so, I really do think that, even this first section here is particularly interesting because memory itself, our understanding of history, is now entirely predicated on, as what Jürgen talks about, is just we have books, we have primary sources, we have accounts, but no one is alive to tell us what the 19th century was like. I mean, we can look up, old British Pathé film reels about that, but all those people are dead. No one who fought in the Great War is alive anymore. I think the last one died, I think in 2010 or 11 here in the United States, 2008 in Germany. There's no real memory of what that world looked like. And it was really interesting because a friend of the show, Stephen Carson, had said that he had, before he died, he met Erich von Knott-Ledeen. And it's just he has a memory of what the 19th century, what Europe was like before the Great War. And it's just you can tell that this was a different kind of people, something that we have no real conceptualization of socially. And so when we consider the 19th century, we can talk about nationalism, we can talk about the railway, we can talk about the Industrial Revolution, everything that comes with that, and the massive revolts of 1848, everything from 1789, the war against Napoleon, everything, in Europe, of course. I mean, I took a 19th century in Europe course in college, and we really did focus on these three big issues, which was the redrawing of the map, of course, meaning the wars of unification, the ideology of say nationalism, communism, socialism, and sort of radical egalitarianism, and then also globalism, because this is where Europe really becomes the global system as we know now. The communications are faster. This is the first century that kind of gives us a mirror into what the modern world looks like. And so I think when we take a look at the books, especially like maybe the first 150 some odd pages, it is chock full of mind-boggling numbers, in the sense that, like, for instance, the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, it's like 80,000 ethnic Germans were, evicted out of France during this conflict over Alsace-Lorraine. And that, of course, being a big issue over, the territory even in World War I, and the land that would be split up after the Great War ends. And so the author does an amazing job, not only just contextualizing Europe, and of course it being one of the more central players of the 19th century, but also just the scale and the speed in which it takes place. Because, I mean, for Americans, like, we have our own Civil War narrative about what takes place in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, about, the war between the states, and we have the bleeding Kansas, and then Reconstruction, and the Klan, and the federal, Freedmen's Bureau, while at the same time, like, a lot of our policy towards the Chinese is because we're using Chinese refugees as cheap labor, because they just had the Taiping Rebellion, which killed millions of people in this war of religious extremism and imperial control. The Book in the Heavenly Kingdom is actually a really great history of that.
It is funny you mention that, because everyone has heard about Chinese railway workers, and you hear. I was even watching this movie the other day that I didn't even care for, called Train Stories, and that factored very prominently into it. But very rarely do people ask, what are all those Chinese people doing in North America? And then you hear about that. It's like, oh, there's a massive rebellion, there's massacres, and that no one really looks into that. That's what this book really tries to do, is it contextualizes everything within the global scope. And you had mentioned something there that was very interesting, and I forgot to mention. It is pretty much the birth of globalism as we know it. And yes, there's international trade prior to that. But as I said, it was a mind.
Well, even like the Bronze Age had international trade. I mean, even prior to the Bronze Age collapse, like every major global empire or power at the time was 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from everyone else by a trade. Like Hammurabi knew of the Minoans. Like, it's a strange thing to conceptualize for a pre telecommunications age, but I mean, it's just like that exists. They may not have a map or a better understanding of each other in the way that you and I can go on twitter.com and realize that, like, there's a subcontinent of like 1 billion people we don't want to be around. But it's an interesting thing. Whereas like the 19th century, you have we're no longer relying on just like information travels as fast as the boat gets it to you. And in fact, like the first real global surveillance state, there's a whole other book on this very issue about the British Crown and intelligence through the use of the telegraph. But I mean, now you don't have to rely on information. And then even the photography is a thing here now. Like, we have, almost every conflict since the American Civil War, of course, has been photographed. But even in Europe, conflicts that we have little information on, we do have, daguerreotypes and other things like that. So it's just now information is suddenly this instantaneous form of communication, which, as you and I know, Dimes, like you look at like, oh, well, like now we have real space-based communication, wherein like we can constantly put out new documents all the time to reify and to reiterate an imperial message. And Jürgen Osterhammel takes a really good. He doesn't mention Innis at all. I don't think at all in the book, but like he's directly building off of that when he's like, well, now we have the conversation around empires, leviathans versus behemoths, and what kind of symbolism are we going to use to get all of these different disparate religious and ethnic groups to unite, quote unquote, under like a symbol, a common flag, banner, or creed. And he does a really good job, I think, of offering a pretty. I don't even want to call it like an explicitly. I mean, yeah, there's probably a very liberal frame to it, but I mean, there is. I think he does a very good job of at least having a citation for everything, in the sense that like we can actually look towards this and say like this is a pretty comprehensive breakdown behind like why the nationalism is understand the way that it is in like contemporary academic circles.
Yeah, and like I said, the historiographical study here is like things that you think are either perennial or eternal could just be fairly recent. And one of the things you notice when you enter into the space is things you thought were ancient turned out to be relatively new. The status quo might be more recent. And so there's a lot of aspects of our modern world that people think stretch back way earlier or even newer, but like you can kind of pinpoint the birth of globalism as we know it, nationalism as we know it, and he to the point you were just making, he'll get to this in a little bit about the emergence of the press and the press as this sort of job or class that has to keep a global mindset, which didn't happen before. Like your job is to think about the rest of the world as just a citizen, or that's your job, and to take world events and repackage them for your people, because the people generally have an interest in world events. That didn't really exist much before. If you had people who were interested in other cultures and the goings on the rest of the world, you're part of the intelligentsia. And it wasn't just mass produced and it wasn't a given that the average person would care about any of that. But then you start to see that happen not that long ago. and then with the birth of that, then it spirals into what we have now, where every single thought is contextualized globally. As we just said, you're having a barbecue and you're thinking, what do the Japanese think of this? That's wild, right? Someone said Prude is bald. No, he is not. Prude is not bald, Big Ben.
Not yet.
I wonder if I'm gonna get bald one day.
I've been struck by the Reaper, but I'm not bald yet.
I'd get a toupee, I think.
I'm just gonna go to Constantinople and get it fixed.
I'm just gonna go to China and get a Chinese haircut, just the long ponytail in the back. That's something Gio would do. Here's a part here.
No, he just wears the fez. That's what he does.
He gets a Chinese haircut but hides it under the fez. Classic Gio. There's this part here. Let me make sure it's on the right page. 24. I believe. Yes. Okay. So he says, today's perceptions of the 19th century are still strongly marked by its own self-perception. The reflexivity of the age, especially the new media world it created, continues to shape how we see it. The 19th century is no longer actively remembered, only depicted. It has this in common with earlier ages. In the history of the representation of cultural life, however, it occupies a distinctive place that already sets it apart from the 18th century. Indeed, many of the forms and institutions of current cultural life are inventions of the 19th century. The museum, the National Archive, the National Library, statistical science, photography, the cinema, recorded sound. It was an era of organized memory and also increased self-observation. And above all else, that's the message I took from this book. It was the era, I don't want to use the word meta-analysis, but I'll say self-analysis, because perhaps meta-analysis came later as a consequence of not only self-analysis from an intelligentsia or an academia, but filtered on through to the populace, to the regular people. This is something everyone did. It was the beginning of like organized memory, obsession with recording. Of course, there were censuses dating back to Rome. Of course, there were censuses in ancient China all over the world, but a lot of that was very rudimentary. You started to see the dawn of a new era of statistical science where we were getting into the quanta of like what qualitative measures do we have about the people. It's not just how many identities do we have, it's how do they behave. What did they think? How do they relate to each other? And then that, of course, leads into the dawning of psychoanalysis. So a lot of this is just part of one long transition, I believe. And so just to move forward here a little bit, building on that idea, let's make sure. Here we go. I'll just leave it right here. It says, The 19th century can be thought of today as global because that is how it thought of itself. The universality of libraries, exhibitions, and encyclopedias signaled a new phase in the development of the knowledge society in Europe. The most important theoretical currents of the time, being positivism, historicism, and evolutionism, shared a cumulative and critical conception of knowledge that went together with the idea of its public significance. Knowledge was supposed to be educative and useful. I like that. The knowledge needed to have a utility to it now. The new media made it possible to unite the traditional and the new. In no other civilization had the culture of scholarship developed in such a direction. In Japan and China, among others, however, the educated elites were willing to play an active role in shaping the transfer of new European conceptions and the institutions associated with them. This transfer got underway in the last third of the 19th century, but in most places it became really noteworthy only after 1900. The 19th century was an age of well-nurtured memory. I love that line too. An age of well-nurtured memory. It's where, everyone is obsessed with the recording of information. And that's where you have photography begin and take off. Of course, that was spawned by the technology itself, but it coincided with this obsession of documenting everything, preserving everything. It's an era of not only self-awareness, but the preservation of everything around us all the time. And of course, that then spirals into what we have right now. But I think if you trace the roots of that, it's not like it just fell out of the sky one day, like some people think. Like people think that the internet ruined everything or movies ruined everything. It's there's a long genealogy to all this stuff. Just looking at the chat again here. What are we talking about?
Yeah, there's a section.
Someone's calling me a quanta or qualia. Here's your answer. I don't know, and I don't give a care. Everyone knows what I meant.
There's when we're talking about Europe, but also nurturing memory there. He's got a great section on the European transformation about memory, as well as this greater sort of national understanding of the self. He talks especially about libraries and what then constitutes like what's worthy of preservation. And I'm just going to read this short section. It's very early on. It's like it's page 30 on the PDF.
Yeah, here we go.
We can bring it up so chat can follow along. Reading here, he says, libraries understood as managed collections of the printed cultural heritage are also treasuries of memory. The 17th and 18th centuries made the first great advances in this respect in Europe. Between 1690 and 1716, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in his capacity as the librarian to place Duke August's magnificent collection in the small German town of Wolfbüttel at the service of scholarship. Shortly afterward, the university nearby Göttingen went a step further and for a time was reputed to possess the best organized library in the world. The British Museum, initiated in 1753, was conceived from the outset as a national library, incorporated the Royal Library in 1757, and was entitled to receive a copy of every book published in the United Kingdom. Antonio Penzini, an Italian exile who joined the British Museum in 1831, served as its chief librarian between 1856 and 1866, created the foundation of scientific librarianship, a systematic and comprehensive catalog, and a reading room organized to meet the needs of scholars with a domed shape that made it the envy of the world. As the century wore on, national libraries, in keeping with the British model, were built in every continent. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, the Anglosphere, they arose out of parliamentary libraries. Some were linked to academic institutions. They tended the nation's memory for a respectable public and all serious students, but they also collected knowledge in general. The most prestigious became known for their universal reach as they gathered knowledge from all countries and all ages. Important prerequisites for this mission were a book trade with worldwide business links or the selling of private libraries on the antique market. The newly founded Oriental departments collected books in rare languages, sometimes sending out special emissaries to acquire them. Libraries symbolized a country's pretension to equal or superior cultural status. In the 1800s, the young American Republic staked its claim with the founding of the Library of Congress, and by the 1930s, its vast holdings, the largest anywhere in the world, completed the cultural emancipation of the New World from the Old. Countries that achieved unification late in the day had a harder time. The Prussian State Library did not gain national status before 1919, and Italy has never established a single all-embracing national library.
To this day, Italians just don't have a fucking library.
Well, I'd imagine that for some Italians, that might just be like the Vatican archive.
Yeah, with Italians, they just have.
Maybe they just don't build shit. You know, there you go. They're just like, yeah, we're just gonna watch the guys build it instead. It's the great Italian pensioner pastime.
They got other two books. It's the Bible and a book of pasta recipes. And the danger is that these, over time, inevitably become synthesized. You don't need a pasta Christ, or you didn't know you needed it until you saw it. A little early for blasphemy, isn't it, Dimes? Anywho.
I was gonna say, aren't you the Catholic?
Allegedly. As I said, one of my...
Doesn't you just celebrate Palm Sunday?
One of our most beloved fans of Blood Cele once labeled me a scandal upon the Catholic Church. So, I take Germans seriously on most matters. So...
They would know.
They would know. Well, they like you to think that they know. This is getting to what you were getting to before, and it sounds like we're getting lost in the historiography session. But I think this is where a lot of
this was my favorite section because I think this was. I mean, it's a short part of the book, but I think it's arguably the most important because the linguistic and the Dire Vatican Archives edition went, oh man, I would love to get access to that, but one, I'm not Catholic, and two, would they even let us podcast from the Vatican Archives? We're live, and we're gonna read some 12th century Pope's opinion on the Filioque. We're gonna be here for 3 hours because none of us can read ancient Italian or High Latin.
You're never allowed to disparage the Pope, but let me just say that with the current Pope, I think the opportunities are wide and varied that we could just get into the Vatican Archives and podcast there. I think there's a lot of new horizons for dumb shit to happen. So, looking at this, the century...
The papacy gets its first American. We're just hot dogs and podcasts in the Vatican Archives.
It's like everyone likes the young Pope. Everyone liked the new Pope. You can just do that. You had an opportunity to do that.
I'm literally speaking at a conference where the theme is you can just do things.
You can just... They filmed it in the Vatican. All you guys saw it being filmed, and you saw everyone loved it. Just do that. You don't need to go the other way. Even John Malkovich was good in that. All right, so
just be a chud.
Just be a cool cigarette smoking chud. What have we learned if not that? We don't have the Trumpian Pope yet. By Trumpian, I mean you can just be like a blathering mean guy. We can't get into politics right now. It says the century is a creature of the calendar, a calculated quantity, which was introduced for the first time in the 1500s. For historians, it is, as John M. Roberts put it, only a convenience. The less they believe in the objective coherence of an age, and the more they see dividing lines between epochs as pure convention, the fewer objections there can be to a simple chronology that operates with chunks of 100 years. In the case of the 19th century, however, the lusterless boundary dates underscore the formal character of the procedure. Neither the beginning year nor the end year of the calendar century coincided with a major turning point. Years with 2 or 3 zeros are often not the watershed that remains fixed in the memory of a nation. It is not 2000, but 2001 that is engraved in the mind. Good point. Issues of dating were everywhere central for modern history and archaeology. In Japan, an extra-European pioneer in this respect too, it was only after the turn of the 12th century that a satisfactory national chronology was developed for remote periods of the past. Whereas in China, whose rich historiographical tradition went as far back as Europe's, the necessary work of source criticism began in the 1920s and took decades before a reasonably dependable chronology of ancient times was established. So it really comes down to how many different civilizations were trying to apprehend their own past. And that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I think the fact that so many different civilizations, who again had no real civilizational overlap, all kind of aligned on this century model is interesting. Like the way the world became Eurocentric wasn't because exclusively of military imperialism. I think that's one. That's when sort of mythology or bit of alleged wisdom that the book challenges, that you assume that Europe ended up on top just because of wicked machinations or just outright conquest. And that isn't the case, especially in the 19th century. It's just, it was innovating these concepts that just swept the world like wildfire. It wasn't through any sort of exertion of power or subterfuge. And I think that's interesting. I have no reason to distrust the book either. I think it's a serious book, and maybe the author would not agree with many of our political standings or ideas on how the world works, but I don't know, history is fucking history.
It's the same way I don't think Thomas Moynihan would agree that the most popular podcast covering his book is by us. And I'm sure, like, for instance, like, I've interviewed Andrew McLuhan, and it's just like, I don't think that he probably agrees that I have a deeply reactionary understanding of his grandfather, but like, I don't really think that matters, because again, for the sake of what we're trying to review here and what we're discussing is the historiography, but also an understanding of where the 19th century and its impact still on today's world. And also, like, you do have the Gregorian calendar reforms that have played a role there, but also, as he goes on later in this section of the book, the creation of the Greenwich Mean Time sort of becoming the sort of standard globally, and then of course with America, the rail lines and our time system, and it eventually being adapted as we start playing into mass transportation, but also instantaneous communication for the purposes of trade. It's not just like those mean old Europeans conquered the world, and I mean, that is a good thing, but secondly, it's that the nature of just having accurate understanding of where things are is required. It is interesting, though, how like the European conception of these certain terms of like the century or the novel or our forms of high culture or even low culture, like the dime novel, like that's an American thing, but it's also a part of like the European understanding of like adventurism in our time abroad, whether it's like missionary work and my time over and abroad. Because there's a bunch of this is one of my favorite things about, like, oh boy, not another right-wing book publishing company. I welcome all right-wing book publishing companies, because there's so much stuff in the public domain where it's like travel logs that were very popular in the 19th century about their time in Brazil or in Africa or parts of the Far East that we don't have a word for or a conceptualization for. And German word cell author conveniently skipping the 18th century. Well, there's like a million other German authors for that too. But in this regard, I think that, for this section of the book, that focusing so much on like the historiography and the methodology, is that not every country or not every part of the world has that European imprint. So for instance, like in Japan, because eventually the markets open up because of the Americans, but even earlier on due to European influence through trade alone, Japan is more quick to adopt European style novels and European sort of cultural affectations in comparison to the Chinese, who resist it more than the Japanese did. And for the Chinese, like, they have a much more a wider cultural memory of the 19th century than, say, the United States does. I mean, the biggest thing about maybe our impact of the 19th century is going to be the American Civil War for most Americans' minds, despite the fact that we begin the 19th century in the U.S. basically with the Louisiana Purchase, which is doubling the size of the U.S. territory.
Yeah, I was going to say something. One thing that I forget what I was going to say. I'll just move on to here, because this actually builds on what you were just saying. Make sure I'm on the right page here. Page 82 here. Here we go. I was going to read here. It says, in terms of social history, a distinctive feature of the Sattelzeit was the growing contestation and subversion of traditional hierarchies. And this is a big theme in the book. It remains to be proved whether the years around 1800 were also a period of agrarian change and rural unrest outside Western and Central Europe. There's a lot of evidence that they were. Notwithstanding the revolutions in France and Haiti, this was a period when social traditionalism was shaken but not yet overthrown. With a handful of exceptions, the rise of the bourgeoisie and more generally the emergence of new social forces would be a feature only of the subsequent period. Fully fledged bourgeois societies remained in a minority throughout the 19th century. A growing tendency towards class formation was a direct consequence or accompaniment of the gradual spread of industrial capitalism throughout the world, which did not begin until 1830 and reached the most advanced country in Asia, being Japan, only after 1870. So, he's describing something that I don't think a lot of people would debate, which is that ideology follows technological development. And some people say that economics sits at the top of that pile. I'm not so sure. I think economics might very well follow technological innovation as well. But I'm also not trying to just think of this completely linearly. Like a lot of people, like what causes everything. I don't think in those terms. But here you see the spread of the Industrial Revolution, and you can chart its pervasiveness throughout this entire century, and then following that, class consciousness. Maybe not explicitly Marxism, but wouldn't it be interesting if there was an emergent class consciousness that was not strictly attributed to Marx, or to put a finer point on it, a crowning, that's a gruesome way of putting it, but the birth of sort of a populist self-awareness, because it says the century self-awareness, but you have the class consciousness being driven by these people just getting, I don't know what you could say the specific cause was, because it was also the migration, and he talks about this later in the book, up from the agrarian areas to the urban areas. Of course, there were urban areas prior to this, but there was more of a huge shift from people to urban centers. So it was the complete disrupting of where everyone was and how everyone related to each other and how they thought of themselves and fucking everything. And I think you get that, and then the age of revolutions makes sense. The age of increasingly frequent revolts and rebellions against power structures, which is what we inhabit right now, whether or not they're real and practical or just, again, another commodity and just something that you say. But I think it starts here, and once you see the complexity of the tectonic shifts that were occurring, like you can't even just say it was because a great man thought of it. An ideology came tumbling out of his brain and his mouth, and that inspired everyone. That's part of it, but that's more working in parallels with everything else that's going on. It's a much more complex ecosystem, which is what I find so interesting about the book. Someone says, "Shit, guys, I'm late. What did I miss?" You missed the 19th century. Everyone's missed it.
You've been in a coma since 2016. Oh man, I can't wait to go to my favorite MPI conference host.
Can you imagine a guy waking up from a coma in 2016, but then forgetting 9/11 happened? Like he didn't go into a coma in 97. He just went after 9/11, but forgot it, then had to relearn it again.
Oh
Man,
my gosh.
I can't wait to go to the World Trade Centers.
It's where I met my wife.
A guy comes out of a coma. It turns out he was just a fucking retard. Also, he just didn't know things. It's completely unrelated to the coma. Oh man!
We thought your brain oxygenation levels were down, but I'm sorry, ma'am. Your husband's a retard.
Sorry, he's come up with a positive case of retardation. Oh no, and also AIDS. How? Javier Oliva says, what about the lesser-known Library of Alexandria, where they housed their ancient hip-hop Harlequin romances and the first ever copy of 50 Shades of
That
Grey?
was the first Barnes and Noble.
I think someone made a comment earlier about libraries being the cause of all their problems, because that could have been like
I don't really think that like the ancient, or even like the if we were to go to 1930 and go to the Library of Congress, I don't think we're going to find literature. I think we're going to be okay.
Going back to the Library of Alexandria is just slop. It's slop all the way down. That's what being trad's about. Everyone acts like trad is What? Holding a spear? Having 25 kids? No, it's reading dog shit. It always has been. My ancestors are smiling on me. Can you say the same for yourself? Had they the podcasting?
I
tools
love that this one line from Skyrim has just become the epitome of all of what we do.
The whole idea of a patriarchy is to keep your estate captive under your domain so that you have a podcast audience with the tools that you had at the time. Sorry, go ahead.
That's what we should do. We just need to go back in time, and it's just like you need to record all of your speeches, all of your thoughts, all of the dumb shit you said with your friends.
You go back in time, go into your ancestor's estate. He's just got a very exhausted family gathered around him. He says, "What if the emperor was black and Chinese?"
Hear me out, everyone. What is the Kaiser? Was an Oriental.
You go back into ancient Rome when everyone's dressed in like Nazi Third Reich uniforms. Like, it's so weird. Everything.
Wow, Nietzsche was right. It's the eternal recurrence.
Man, everything I thought was fucked up. It turns out the wrongest guy I knew was the most correct. They had UFOs too.
Oh man.
Man, I gotta buy more Arctos books. Anywho.
What's also interesting though is that he doesn't shy away in the book at all from talking about not only just like cultural arenas, but also in respects to how politics is, again, I'm going to use an I word, how intersectional class, ethnicity, religion, race, and economic status is. And how, depending on your location and depending on where you are, one of those is going to take a greater precedent, or it's going to weigh far more than, say, the rest of those small intersectionalities. He doesn't mention this in the book. At least memory doesn't serve. I can Control F and do it again. But for instance, in places like Venezuela and Colombia, when we're having these waves of French-inspired as well as Haitian-inspired revolutions of sort of these radical, liberal, and to some extent racial egalitarianism, you have this concern of mainly like white Creoles in Venezuela and Colombia. They have this term called basically like partocracy. Basically, it's just like the great fear that basically that like the white Creoles would lose their political power, and it's going to instead be exercised by like anyone lower than them, primarily like the descendants of Africans and like other Indian slaves. And that sort of concern plays a large role in a lot of the colonial maintenance of territory, is sort of this fear of the ethnic identity being overruled or overwritten, even in places like in Central and in South America. And then even then you have an open ethnic conflict being described in places like in the Balkans, because, prior to World War I breaking out, you had the Balkan War in 1912 to 1913. I think it was like the second one. They had one even earlier than that in the beginning of the 20th century. But all of these things, of course, are being reorganized from conflicts that take place in the 19th century. And everything that plays a role therein. And it's particularly important to consider that when Osterhammel starts really talking about what generated so many of these conflicts or these nationalist identities, or why people started organizing behind a banner, is because, the 18th and 17th centuries, and of course the 19th, are completely filled with conflict that lead to, the destruction of empires. We, of course, have the history of Poland. We then have to take a look at the relationship between the Eastern question, more specifically about the Ottoman Empire, and how the Ottoman Empire is trying to view itself vis-a-vis Europe and trying to stand on its own feet, despite the fact that it has fought numerous conflicts against Europe, both in the name of a religious, but also to a large extent an ethnic conflict against the European peoples and their own religion. And I think that what this book does a really good job of is trying to make sense of how these things became ranked order, or why nationalism and this greater sort of ethnic consciousness really is birthed out of the European conflicts that take place. And just as we've talked about in other books like The Hour of Decision, those ideas, even the most destructive ones like Bolshevism, communism, and socialism, all have a very distinct European origin point to the problems of Europe that are then transliterated to the rest of the world, that has then been used as the sort of ideological cover / cudgel against sort of the developed or the white world, as Spangler and others have described it as.
Yeah, and what's interesting there, you mentioned something that I like to underscore here, and we're going to get to this more in the next episode because we're going to focus more on the nationalist projects. But one thing that stuck out to me while reading this book, and I brought it up in the last Vanguard's Journal article, I believe, in the definition of a nation, is that, and we're defining nationalism as a 19th century phenomenon, not just another word for self-conceptualization, but he had pointed out that the vast majority, if not all, nationalist movements occur inside of another country, typically inside of an empire, the Ottoman Empire, or it could be any country that operates like an empire. But that lends to the idea that to have a nationalist movement, you need to be existing within a power structure that almost sees you as a threat. It exists under pressure. Now, that could be occurring within a nation, or it could be a nation undergoing a unification because you've identified a different sort of exterior power that you feel is driving that, which means to say that without an awareness of aggressive and an aggressive incursion of power, you don't have the necessary energy for any sort of unification movement or nationalism. So if you, as a people, let's say, and maybe there's parallels we can draw with movements in our milieu right now, unless you can very accurately and very pointedly identify who the enemy is, you can't really get a nationalist movement. So that's why it's hard to even bring people, if you have some sort of ethnic nationalist movement, let's say white nationalism, if you, like, it's almost like the first step to get people into all the ideas is to get them locked in the idea that you exist within an enemy system that is, oppressing you or targeting you or something, but you need to have a conceptualization of the enemy. Otherwise, they just don't have the ability to even act within their own interests. And that's why, like, none of the other stuff will even make sense to them. And it's very difficult for them to do. But you can do this with other groups, Christians, Catholics, whatever it might be, but that's just one example. Now, moving on there, since we're into a section that I like to call space and geography, I'm just looking at page 104 here. I brought this up a little bit earlier, but I really liked it. And it's, we asked not only what was the 19th century, but where was the 19th century? And how European or Anglo norms became so popular. He says here, the metamorphosis of European spatial semantics are best illustrated by the region known as East Asia. The term is more common in geography and sociological area studies than among philologists, since there's no obvious linguistic case for bracketing China, Japan, and Korea together. The three languages are constructed quite differently. Sinology, Japanology, and Korean studies are still separate disciplines, often jealously protective of their independence. But since their origins in the 19th century, they themselves have had no difficulty in employing the common term East or Eastern Asia. In fact, as a vague, mainly topographical designation, it first appeared in English, French, and German in the late 18th century, but it only became universally accepted in the 1930s after the rise of the United States as a Pacific power made it seem absurd to continue using the Eurocentric Far East. Logically, only the term Russian Far East, meaning Siberia, would have been plausible. When the term Far East was coined towards the end of the 19th century, it had a dual meaning. On the one hand, it took cliches about the Muslim Orient and extended them farther east so that China, Japan, and Korea now appeared as those parts of a generalized Orient where the yellow races lived. But on the other hand, and far more importantly, it operated as a geopolitical strategic concept. This could appear only after the traditional Sinocentric world order had disappeared. So I love that. The development of gradually even these locations adopting the norms put forth by originally Europe, but then America. And it happened pretty fast. You know what I mean? And I never had this answered. Maybe someone in the chat can, but it's my understanding that Japan is known as Nippon, Nippon, or is it pronounced Japan? Like, what's the story there? Do you know?
That would be a good question to ask. I mean, I imagine it's sort of similar to in the way like Turkey has its own word for themselves that they're trying to project. I don't know, but Japan is just, I guess it's always been Nippon, just Nippon Steel or Nippon. I mean, to me, it's just how I've heard it.
But, I'm just like, why do we call it? Did someone in Europe just call it Japan one day, and now they're called Japan, and even they do it? I guess that was what I was trying to get at, because it seems that we have that power.
It comes from an old Chinese word.
This is
So I
getting more
imagine
complex.
Marco Polo brought it back from Europe and it stuck around is the popular term. He introduced Japan to Europe is Cipangu based on a Chinese pronunciation, Jipang from Malaysia and Indonesia from the 16th century. So probably just if how it came from in English. So yeah, I guess that's how it is. Again, older forms of international trade and then how it's been anglicized. Through a different country telling us what it's called.
And just to build on that, you saw the, what would we call it? The formalization of spaces and of boundaries and borders, but the development of the state as well. And it says here, the 19th century saw the birth and spread of the clearly marked territorial limit as a peripheral organ of the sovereign state, equipped with symbols of majesty and guarded by policemen, soldiers, and customs officials. It was at once a byproduct and marker of the territorialization of power as control over land became more important than control over people. Sovereign authority was no longer invested in a personal ruler, but in the state. Its territories had to be continuous and rounded off. Scattered holdings, enclaves, city-states, or political patchwork quilts were now seen as anachronisms. So that would be the traditional hierarchy. That would be perhaps a more organic way of designating domains that can control people. There was a push for city-states that had a firmer control of territories that could coherently project its power within its boundaries. And so you start with that, and it's very easy to see in the oncoming distance the development of total war. The leading up to World War I, this perpetual drive for armament and to project security and the city-state not locked into the whims of any aristocracy. And in fact, what he gets to later is that the 19th century was the beginning, if not the full separation of the powers, the institutions from the traditional hierarchy. That would be the monarchy, that would be the aristocrats, the traditional elites, and they were still present, but there was the creation of this idea that the institutions were more important than the people who populated the institutions. Because that, like, the state is almost, I hate to use this word again, but like an egregore. It's some free floating thing that people can occupy or be in service of. And you kind of get that now with Trump and the deep state. But that's just one extreme battle within that. But everyone kind of understands that, yeah, there's the state, there's the government. What are you going to do? You can't fight City Hall. That's the maxim, right? You can't fight City Hall. What the fuck is City Hall? It's not just a synonym for the Parliament or the Congress. It's like there's this idea of City Hall, and no person can fucking do anything with it. It's the idea of it's bigger than everyone, and that sort of process begins here, at least in my reading. But again, that's relatively new. So as we were talking about before, just sit and try to imagine a world before that, because you might still be prone to think that, yeah, we've had just these organs of the state forever. No, not really. Try and really sit and wonder what was a monarchy actually like to inhabit. And only weirdos like us tend to do that. But for the regular people at home, and this is the point of the book, how much of your life was just innovated within the 19th century? It's not that ancient.
Yeah, and I mean, this is why I found the section about just like again, there's a lot of conceptual history here, just entirely predicated on the premise of memory, because it's just like, well, at the end of the day, there is the very real, like, we don't think about it because we've always grown up with it. This is how we've been socialized to understand the world. we don't really need to think about it in any other sort of concept. So why bother, why participate, or why think about it in any way, other way, shape, or form, when it's just like, well, when we consider the fact that the world as we know it is actually kind of young in our conceptualization of time, like that becomes very important. And also it allows us to understand that like our own understanding of immigration or of population density is also very young in relation to the world around us. And I find that to be a particularly interesting thing to consider when we're looking at a world that is still very much affected by, you know, the for lack of a better word, like trauma of conflicts past. You know, the 19th century is very prominent in the Chinese political understanding of the world around them. And then also at the same time, like our understanding of like, you know, refugee policy is also heavily predicated on like the 19th century's conflicts. And what do you do when like 800,000 people of mixed groups are now part of a quote unquote peripheral area or part of your sphere of influence? Like, do you make that a territory? Do you make that something, or do you just call it its own state and see what happens? And this is why such even small minorities of populations, as long as they have a rigid sense of identity, let's say the Serbs, for example, can create such a massive amount of, I don't want to say like trouble in like a negative sense, but like can, you know, greatly affect the world stage in a way that we may not really understand or appreciate. And I think that that's something that the author does a really good job at sort of discussing is that once they're sort of self-conceptualization, then all of a sudden like, hey, you now have to seriously contend with the fact that the world is going to operate under this lens and spreads. It's not just located to Europe by the nature of how we interact with one another. We're now going to talk about these things, and now someone's going to be able to read and understand, oh, well, this is, you know, this conceptualization is the right one, and this is how we're going to apply it to our own country, despite the fact that it has no historical parallel or, you know, example here in the, you know, let's say, you know, oh, like this thing about like monarchy and you know, well, that doesn't have any real implication to like say like the average American, in the same way that like the working conditions of like, you know, German and European writers were going to have, like their understanding of socialism is vastly different than say what gets used by like some socialist party in South Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about sort of the emergence of identities and the conflict of identities. And there's this one part that I had to jump to when I heard that. And I want to get this out because, you know, sometimes these episodes go on for like 2.5 hours sometimes, but we have to make this a slightly shorter one tonight. So I might be speeding through some of this. But believe it or not, we got notes that speak to a lot of this. And he gets to the part here. It's an important dimension, all of this, as we're talking about nationalism. This really was not the first, but a crucial era of the diaspora. Of course, there's been diasporas throughout history. Of course, there's been refugees, however you choose to define that. There's been migration movements, primarily driven by natural disasters and whatnot. But due to the development of global trade and global communications, you started to see more economic migration. He says here, no other epoch in history was an age of long-distance migration on such a massive scale. He says between 1815 and 1914, at least 82 million people moved voluntarily from one country to another at a yearly rate of 660 migrants per million of the world population. The comparable rate between 1945 and 1980, for example, was only 215 per million. One should, and he continues on here, I'm just going to jump ahead to page 219.
It's an insane number.
Oh, 129, actually. 129. And again,
but also
it's
the world
not,
population is much smaller.
Yeah, it's much smaller. And again, it wasn't like there was an era pre-diaspora and post-diaspora. However, once you have these mass migrations, oftentimes either due to economic concerns or to, I'm thinking of like the Irish potato famine here is just one example of, you know, crises that are driven by, imperialism, trade bullshit. Like it wasn't. It was the potato blight, but it was also the response to it, and it was also technology allows you to be a diaspora people. And there's an argument to be made that due to the other forces at work we're describing, people were able to conceptualize themselves as a nation even better. You could be a people transplanted in another country, and you can recreate that company there, or that country there, rather. Whereas before, you might have assimilated easier. But because there's such a mass migration, and each individual is now possessing of a more advanced software to carry the and sort of apprehend this idea of an identity, which they might not have had in full resolution before, then you have a more potent diaspora people, and then more of them. He continues on here. One should not think of all spaces as continuous. In the 19th century, too, the life of a society did not always unfold on a joined together to territory. The most important type of discontinuous social space is a diaspora. That is, a community that lives outside its real or imagined land of origin, yet still feels loyalty and emotional attachment to it. Each diaspora differs from others in its origin and historical experience. The following categories may be identified: a victim diaspora, or a labor diaspora, a trade diaspora, an imperial diaspora, like colonists and settlers, and a cultural diaspora. Diaspora formation as a result of mass migration was ubiquitous in the 19th century. Oh, he says here, only the French stayed at home. China, the epitome of a rounded civilization that no one might be expected to leave, became a source of overseas communities. The formation of nation states in Europe made the lot of minorities more difficult, so they were more willing to emigrate at a moment's notice when overseas labor markets were thrown open. So you have diaspora communities being driven also by the emergence of nationalism. It is the solidifying of identities and borders. It is the scientific reifying of data and ideas and memory and conceptualization of self. It's like everything becomes more rigid. Everything becomes in sharper relief around this time. And it's not because of propaganda. It's not because of hatred or anything. It's just awareness of self will reflexively create an awareness of the other. And you'll be able to more accurately identify how distant the other is from you. And so it's just this grand reshuffling of communities hasn't really stopped since then. But I think you could make the case that it made people more open to be a diaspora. Of course, you have the Jews here, and then there's the Jews. Of course, they were a pretty notorious diaspora people, but that was
They're also not the only ones.
yeah.
I mean, even in the United States, it literally takes the First World War to effectively destroy the sort of like diaspora understanding of like German identity in the United States. Because, in large swaths of the Midwest, it is German-speaking towns, German newspapers, and that doesn't really go away until, Uncle Sam decides to fight the Hun.
We have an interesting comment here that I wanted to get to. The potato was a technology in itself. In fact, the potato is a technology only Europeans have perfected. Good vibes emoji. And I learned that fairly recently. Everyone associates potatoes with Ireland. Potatoes came from South America, I believe. So South America or Mexico. It just turned out that they grew phenomenally well in the Irish climate and the Irish soil, and better than they would have grown elsewhere. So, perhaps the potato was destined through divine, solemn providence to take root in Ireland, and of course through the same solemn providence the Irish were punished for reasons that maybe we'll never know, but it's not our job to wait the decisions of God. God saw fit to punish the Irish, and you what they say,
yeah, I
that's
guess
the way the
so.
cookie crumbles.
That's the way the fry fries.
You know what I say to that? I say, that's all she wrote.
And it was murder.
It was murder, she wrote. You know what I say to that? I say to the Irish, I say dunzo. Okay, so
But there's a section on migration that I think is particularly important to maybe. I'm just going to read this section real quick. It's on page. Where is it? I just had it in front of me here. Yeah, so they're page 129, 148 on the PDF. So there did. This is about immigration itself, not just diasporas. So he writes, the settled societies of the 19th century assured themselves of their mobile origins, and new societies such as Australia arose out of mobility then and there. The immigration society so often talked about today is, in fact, one of the greatest innovations of the 19th century. And reading on here before I totally lose my spot. In the 19th century, with mobility as its cornerstone, migration has three closely related aspects: exodus and creation of the new community, the Mayflower motif; survival by means of further intakes of immigrants; and the expansive occupation of new spaces. The 19th century migrations represented three different time layers. They might be a sequel to completed processes in the early modern period, so they rest upon movements stretching back into the previous period, such as forced transfer of slaves, or they might involve a flow of forces that have newly appeared in the 19th century itself, with the transportation revolution and capitalist creation of employment opportunities. These flows do not always follow political chronology. 1914 was for many a key turning point, but even more decisive was the Great Depression in 1929. And I think that's a particularly important thing, that again, like our conception of immigration or our conception of population transfer is again it's still very much rooted in the 19th century.
Yeah, and so that's why it's very difficult to imagine correcting any single one of these social phenomena. Like, it's really everything all at once. We had a donation here. I just wanted to. We got a vague poster over here, but it says,
we love vague posting.
Where does the current exposure of Zionism end? I don't know if that's directed to us specifically or just a general question. I'm not sure.
Well, I think you kind of just covered it when you discussed diaspora communities, because like they're belonging, and even Osterhammel says it, like in a physical or a perceived physical location.
Yeah, it's perceived, and that's what's interesting. It's like whether or not the land is really yours. I think that's what makes an ultimate diaspora. It's the yearning for a home, yearning for a country you never inhabited, yearning for a time that you don't really remember. It's sort of a,
but it's part of that greater conceptualization of self. And I mean, our understanding of modern Zionism is a byproduct to a large extent of 19th century European nationalism, because if you read a lot of what Theodore Herzl wrote and spoke of, if you were to replace like Israel, Zion, and say just Jewry in general, and I mean that in the political sense of the term, not as a derogatory thing, like it's going to read very much like something out of the kind of left-wing nationalist identities and movements that come out when discussing, well, what is the role of a people in place? And we want the same thing. And so, of course, it comes with the baggage of, European Christianity in comparison to the Jewish diaspora. But I mean, nevertheless, like it's very explicitly with a nationalist understanding, even if it's maybe not something that we want to, say, oh, like we're the consequence of that, or we have to own up to that. It's simply just something that we can identify with, that there is an ideological root that's based in our own nationalist movements.
Yeah.
Where it plays in now, like, again, it's the same thing. Like there is that, as I was just reading, like there is that like settler motif, like we are here to build something new. And of course they have a self-conceptualization that is heavily predicated that it is old. You can say whatever you want about various groups of people, like the Chinese or say just Jewish identity, but like it is very much rooted in something that claims to go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, even if like most may be more genetically similar to a lot of Italians, say with like Ashkenazi populations. I still think that it's important to consider that even then there's a lot of the 19th century that plays a large role in this understanding of our current political moment.
What's so interesting is the power of the intellectualization of it all as a driver for action. And I'll give one example being Black nationalism, Black American nationalism. So their blood and soil, because I really do think that's the center of all the sorts of nationalism. It's blood and soil. It's the ethnicity. It's the people,
Yeah.
and it's the land they inhabit. And with African,
That's my biggest disagreement with like Ernst Renan's like what is a nation is that he's just like, well, it's not so much the blood, it's the heroes you identify with, and it's like, yeah, but the heroes belong to a people.
Yeah.
And I think that
I don't
that's
think
sort
you
of
can
important.
reduce it any more than that. Like you can build on top of that, but I'm like, it really just has to be the people and the land. Like you can't reduce it anymore. But with African Americans, let's say, they're
Well, that's where you get the whole like sort of like the black like state in like parts of the global like of the U.S. South, right? Like, oh, well, we'll have something here in Dixie, like that's what it's going to be instead. It's not going to be
And
anything else.
That's very conceptual too for them because their blood is already highly mongrelized by any measure. Like most African Americans are at least half white most of the time, and
I think it's like a 25% European DNA is there.
25 to like there's a lot. Like, they're mostly light skinned. You compare like an American black to a Nigerian black or a real like they're dark as midnight over in Africa, and here you get like Sneeko. What the fuck is Sneeko? Right? There's more of Sneekos out there than there are Hannibal Burris's. But then the soil, well, they hate the soil. They actually don't like America. So their nationalistic movement is a very vaguely ill-defined definition of what the like DNA, the genetics of their people are. But then also they despise America. They don't. The legacy of slavery will be ever present if they remain in America, but they don't feel at home in Africa. Not really. However, they have intellectualized their nationalist movement so much that it still can compel people to action. They can still commit terroristic acts against the system they believe oppresses them and their perceived aggressors. Like it does not seem to inhibit them from collectivizing along those lines, even though it's fucking made up, even though it's a contraption, right? So it's like a very 20th century idea of blood and soil where they have neither blood nor soil to really ground either of it. Just an ideology. Gio's going off in Sneeko and Blood Salad last episode was speak. I feel like Sneeko is designed to go off on. I don't know. To me, it's baffling that anyone could like Sneeko. He's just loathsome to look at. His face is all
But
fucked
you're
up.
saying that as like a white person.
But so is his audience just people who look like him? I can't imagine being a black person and watching Sneeko. You know what I mean? Like I don't
know. It raises an interesting question.
We always ask this: who is this for? I don't know who Sneeko is.
We do. You and I spend more time asking the demo / market research question than I think anything else on this in our like professional / private group chats. It's just like, so who is this for?
Like, I get who Andrew Tate is for. I don't particularly like Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes or all these people, but like I understand your audience. I don't understand Sneeko's audience. I don't know what type of person watches that shit. And I'll see him interact with like a 14-year-old white skater kid. I'm like, there's nothing else on. You have a whole universe of people. You have so many whores. There's so many whores around you all the time right now, and you're watching this genetic lottery loser.
Well, and again, this is partially of the generational divide, but also the just how non-white Gen Z is in America.
So now I haven't heard that. That sounds like a digital archipelago take. I haven't heard that one before. What is that? What's the consensus on Gen Z? I'm old as shit, so it's dangerous for me to even approach this. But
I mean, like I've had conversations with a lot of like I guess you could say like Gen Z right wingers or people who are more aligned with like Nick on certain issues than say I would, maybe on like optics or whatever. And so I just think it really just boils down to that like there's just a lot of people that this is all they've been enculturated with. Like, so for instance, like they doxed the guy who does all the like DHS kind of like fash wave edits that aren't fasc wave, but are clearly inspired by that stuff. And he's 21, meaning he was born, in what, 2005, 2004. So a world and came of age, where this entire universe as we know it, we've taken for granted because that was our years of becoming politically, I guess, involved. And then it's like, well, for him, that's not the case at all. Like that's a big part of just the environment he grew up in was this kind of stuff. So I just think it has a lot to do with socialization and culturation, and also the fact that, like, depending on, your background, what you were raised with, you're going to have a much different understanding of the world than, say, myself or Geo or you. And so I just think that's what it boils down to, which makes a lot of the things even in this text particularly interesting, because this is at a time when the world as we know it is so thoroughly homogenous. There aren't vast diaspora populations in parts of the world unless it's under colonial authority, or it's, say, in the United States and it's immigration. And that's different because most of our immigration, of course, was primarily from European states. Of course, that has its own problems, and that's been at length discussed about. It's the whole reason why we had the immigration restrictions in 1924 take place. It was sort of this winning political issue. So here, when we're talking about nationalism, it's also something that we have to keep in mind, that, like, the nationalism of the 19th century, and that still, haunts us to this day, is at a time when you can have class consciousness and the ramifications of the say, 19th or the Industrial Revolution, take a place. And you kind of see that echo in today's politics, like, and Andrew Yang, who is a joke for all intents and purposes. But the thing that he's really pointing out and making a big deal of is that there is an incoming sort of industrial revolution. And that revolution is really predicated on, like, automation. And what does that mean? That's going to change the immigration game. But it also means they're probably going to keep a lot of cheap labor, as we've seen even in the Trump era, overpaying and hiring people who are respective, like, actual natives to their respective territory and states. And so again, I think the politics of the 21st century is yet to really be written, as we said earlier, because, we're still using 19th century frameworks for worlds and demography that hasn't fully come out of that world. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider when we look at, where are we going politically? And it's just like, well, there's going to be, information technology, let's say, like the singularity, if we want to use a fun tech term, mixed with, like, the social technologies, i.e. the politics of the 19th century. And we're going to try really hard to forget about the 20th, despite the fact that we're literally held back by the 20th century from doing anything differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part. And this book really helps you conceptualize how much of the 20th century is just the 19th century coming to a head.
Yeah, and it is our obsession with these same definitions merely a consequence of us still inhabiting the 19th century, or maybe a more advanced version, but obsession with self and a focus on memory and data that makes transitory things persist. And we'll get into this right now. He talks about the move from the country to the urban areas, the movement away from an agrarian society, people flooding into the cities, which would have occurred then. And we still talk about this divide between the urbanite and the ruralite. Certainly there's something different.
And certainly more of an American, I think, nowadays than anything else.
Yeah, like how different are your lives really? And I'm not talking about in the mountains of Appalachia. That would be one extreme. Of course, there's extremes and there's hillbillies out there, of course. But your average rural, like, you go to a lot of these small towns and you're apt to see a cyber truck. Everyone's actually got the exact same smartphone and TV. They're all actually watching the same bullshit Netflix shows. They're both areas are probably wearing designer jeans of some sort. Like, there's not really a huge difference between an urban white girl and a fucking country white girl. Not really. So, but we're in love with this sort of, just a commoditized idea, like the feud. Like it might as well be Apple versus PC at this point. But we obsess about that because we have a memory, perhaps, or a culturally coded opposition to these things. But like we're just perpetuating it for the sake of it. We're not really investigating whether or not that division really or substantially exists. He goes on here. I like this part. He says, this is a subheading I've got called "The City and the Frontier." He spends a great amount of time talking about
Go for it.
the periphery to empire and civilization. What is the frontier? And we won't get too deep into that right now, but I do find this interesting where he says the modernization of urban infrastructure was a worldwide process which required political will and a high degree of administrative capability, money, and technologies, and also the agency of philanthropic institutions as well as profit-oriented private interests. There were temporal disparities, but the process was generally complete by the 1930s in the major metropolises. What the fuck am I saying? In China, for example, then a very poor country with a weak state, the sanitization and physical development of cities was not confined to the cosmopolitan showcase of Shanghai. After 1900, urban modernization was also found deep in the interior, far from any strong foreign influence, where upper classes at the provincial or municipal level often encouraged and accomplished projects out of nationalist motives. And got this section here. Let me just scroll down. He continues on. In the 19th century, the opposite extreme of city is no longer country, the realm of farming, but rather frontier, the moving boundary of resource development. It advances into spaces that are rarely as empty as the agents of expansion talk themselves and others into believing. For those who see the frontier approaching them, it is the spearhead of an invasion. It will leave little as it was before. People flow into the city and to the frontier. These are two great magnets for 19th century migration towards the cities. And a good example would be in Canada. So Canada was at that time a magnet for the French and also the British, and America is probably the same. Like you wouldn't call them a diaspora people, you'd call them colonists and settlers, but that it's gravitating towards the most extreme frontier imaginable, which would be the fucking untamed terrain of North America, or towards the cities. He said, as spaces of boundless possibility, they attract migrants like nothing else in the age. In relation to the city, the frontier is periphery. It's in the city that frontier rule is ultimately organized, that that the weapons and instruments for its subjugation are literally forged. In 19th century Europe, especially outside Russia, colonial land grabs on a large scale became a rarity. It mainly took the form of settlement. And of course that era eventually ended. Now there are no more undiscovered countries. And I'd like, aside from, you made a comment earlier in the episode that of course we have mass migration, but I believe that the Western people, white people, Europeans, I think they feel locked in place more than ever before. Like, would it be safe to say that in no time in human history do the European peoples feel like they have nowhere else to go? Like, where can you flee to? You can only kind of bounce between the Anglosphere or within the
continent.
European countries. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with our understanding of, say, like expat culture is vastly different than, say, being an expat's a lot different than like, I'm a colonial administrator, which I think plays a role in our understanding of our politics, but also at the same time, like, we're the only countries that have these ridiculous sort of like understandings of the border and border policy, because it's just like, well, Mexico or immigration laws than the United States does when it comes to like birthright citizenship and shit like that. And it's just like they don't have a problem kicking you out. They don't have libtard judge, immigration judges telling me that like, oh, I've got to, keep them in here, just give them a chance. They don't have that problem, It's ridiculous and it's insane. But also at the same time, like, never has the homeland, so to speak. Like, yes, the homeland has had problem, even in America, right? Like, yes, the homeland has had, waves of immigration that certainly question the understanding of like what does it mean to be America, because like, this is stuff that even people like Wilmot Robertson was writing about in the 1970s and 80s with like the disappearing majority, when he's talking specifically about like white Anglo-Saxon society in comparison to like, say, the waves of European immigration and the impact it has on, American society then. So I think that there's just a lot there to consider, that like we feel locked in because our ability to travel or to move and go somewhere has been so radically altered by the politics of our time, which has been a politics of basically self-erasure. And what, Camus talks about is sort of just this like suicidal empathy.
No, I agree completely. Sorry, I was just looking at my phone here. I got a weird text from someone. I think it's someone looking for drugs, and they got the wrong number.
No.
Do you ever do that where you get a text, and someone says, "Hey, man, what's up?" And it's like, "Hey, you." I'm looking to swing by and get some treats. I'm like, "Oh, that can't be anything good. None of this time of night."
You're like, I don't think that's real. I don't think that's me.
No,
I don't have that problem. Unfortunately, I have a I because of some of the work I do a lot of campaign work on the side. I get like a lot of like, "Hi, Matthew, we're with the internal research group, and we really would love your opinion on taxes in the DFW area. Also, just give us a call. We'll throw $50 in if you want to talk about your opinion as a voter about Iran and Israel. Thanks, bye." It's literally that. And I'm just like, do I give them, like, I should just call and just give my most honest opinion and just maybe scare a hoe for like 45 minutes.
Fucking hoes talking like their voice is being played on a keyboard. "Hi, my name is Rebecca. We are for dumb cunts for sodomy." Tell me more.
Tell me more. I'm interested in what candidate you fielded this year.
Sorry,
but I mean that kind of stuff exists. Yeah. Oh no.
We're
Mr. Romano, is that you?
We're getting into the weeds of the episode.
Oh yeah. That's the sort of thing that I get. I don't get text messages where it's like, "Hey, we were wondering if you were like interested in offering your opinion on XYZ issue." And it's like, no, actually, I don't do that. Also, because I do political work on the side, I get a lot of campaign text messages. Like the primary season is always the fucking worst, because there's like a million candidates you're not going to ever vote for. And it's just like, "Well, we want your support in this election." And it's like, yeah, that sounds great, man. I'm not going to give it to you. The guy I'm voting for is my mutual on Twitter. So I'm not doing that.
So we got one from Big Ben here. "The steam engine enabled us to metabolize hydrocarbons. Initially, it was awesome for gains, like an athlete producing carbs. Now we have civilizational diabesity." I'm liking these comments from Big Ben.
These are good comments. And it's also crazy, too, in the same way that, like, how much of our, again, talk about the shadows or the like what we're haunted by. Like, the meme about how shitty British food is. It's like, how much of this is still predicated because of like war rationing, or like how much of our like, America is haunted by Mesoamerican corn demons. It's like, how much of the corn lobby and the corn oil and corn and soybean stuff, how much of this is still from like World War II and also like survivalist rationing stuff out of like the Cold War. It's just like how much of this, terrible diabetes causing nonsense is still kind of a byproduct of the Second World War, and turns out quite a bit.
We're still subject to the reprehensible dietary habits of boomers.
Yes,
we have never exited.
You like your Crisco
intestinal
kids?
Tract. Boomers ate like.
See,
shit.
now that would be a fun theory fiction. And it would easily be, it would easily be also an info hazard to your audience, because it's like, oh, I wrote a book about like the fact that like culturally speaking, like the entire world is still trapped in the like appetites of the boomers, and it's like, oh, that's really cool. What's it called? Boomervore. Why'd you call it that? Because it's really fun for my SEO.
We're just getting so off track, but I do need to say that it's always funny when boomers will throw some shade on the millennials or Gen Z, and they don't update their scripts, so they just say avocado toast. Like
no, it's rotisserie chickens now that are problematic.
But it's like, I know you people.
It's like, sir, like the rotisserie chicken is $4.97 at Walmart right now.
Adjusting for inflation, I know that you would have meals of canned mayonnaised hooves, and those were actually kind of expensive for the time as well. They loved boomers loved canned food. They loved stupid canned food. They loved frozen food that didn't make any sense. They're the first generation, I'm pretty sure, to.
You made Jello salads. I don't think you get to say anything,
Look at a boomer cookbook and see if you can fight the urge to beat them to death with it. like really, look what they're eating. Like, you've never seen canned tuna before. It's like, you can make microwave canned tuna cookbook. This is what real people bought. This is what like your great aunt was reading. Oh God, I hate I hate.
Such a great time.
I wanted to get to this one last part before we move on.
Yeah, let's do that, please.
I think this would be something you would like and would speak to your twisted soul, just like me. It was the birth of international relations, just as a concept, would have been in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, I did enjoy that a lot.
He says, the 19th century saw the birth of international relations as we know it today. In the 19th century, empires and nation states were the largest political units in which human beings led a common existence. By 1900, they were also the only ones with real weight in the world. Nearly everybody lived under the rule of one or the other. There was no sign yet of world government or a supranational regulatory institutions. In this bewildering situation, the present essay sets itself a decidedly more modest task. It sees empire as a special type of polity and as a framework for social life and individual experience, and it simply argues that the 19th century was much more an age of empire than, as many European historians continue to believe, an age of nations and nation states. I think that's important to say. So when we had said the 19th century was important for the formation of nations or nationalism, I don't think you really see the culmination of that until the tail end of the 19th century, or that really is the 20th century, the consequence of that. And who needs to talk about the 20th century right now? Everyone knows everything there's to say about that. But then throughout the 20th century, you start to see the emergence and the consequence of globalism and the convergence of globalism and nationalism into these supranational entities and these elite networks and whatnot. And he goes on here on page 413.
And it's also important to consider, like, when you look at some of the like foundational books on international relations, such as, like Morgenthau's Politics Among the Nations, that like it is a lengthy European centered history that starts at starting at the 17th century, but really comes into full force with the 19th century. because so much of our understanding of international relations is just predicated on how we built the world out of the Napoleonic order. I mean, it's the same thing how Henry Kissinger saw it. He really sees that the history of international relations as like a globalized phenomenon is fundamentally in the wake of Metternich and sort of the creation of the Congress of Europe, and that system has been globalized and systematized to sort of express a understanding of politics that we still use today. Like the international rules-based system is so explicitly European, it hurts. And I say that positively, even though it comes with, a lot of the liberal baggage that we have today, because it's like, well, a lot of our sort of like, globo homo things are predicated out of like progressive European ideals, but the people who are running it are now like Mark Carney instead of Madison Grant. And those are the consequences of our political moment.
Yeah. Like I was saying with Nick Land, that reference earlier, we're discussing inevitabilities. Like you cannot look at the current, let's say, neoliberal order without looking at the previous liberal order and tying that directly to the Enlightenment, which ties directly to the scientific revolution and arguably goes back even further. But let's stop at the scientific revolution, which is the attempt to extract data and knowledge from the natural world, which is a very noble pursuit, and then find the universal truths within that. So it is the distinctly European drive to ascertain universal truths and then project that on the rest of the world. And I think the past couple centuries have been discovering the limitations of that, because we tried it every which fucking way. You've tried to apply the theories of liberalism to vast different types of people, and they just don't take. And so experiment over. Here's what you learn. You learn that you have not discovered a universal truth that is just applicable to all people who are created equal, who are just atomized individuals, blank slates driven by materialist pursuits. That's not how the world works. We must recede and reassess. And I kind of think that's what we're doing right now in so many terms.
Well, even the sort of global, I guess you could say globalist. I mean, I don't like that word because I think it's been memed to death. But like, even amongst like a lot of global, what you would call like globalist publications. So like, I remember even prior to COVID, there was a large degree of discussion about what would be called deglobalization, that we would be returning or retrenching into these sort of global spheres of influence, and that the world as we know it is going to sort of revert back to things that look a little more like the 19th century. And then of course COVID happened, and then we found out that like international supply chains and the things that we appreciate, that we can take for granted, like Amazon or cheap oil, are still heavily predicated by geographical realities and nation states and interest groups that may not agree with you. And those are things that take place. And so again,
that's why
like
the Samuel Huntington's model too, of like almost the reverse.
Oh, the clash of civilizations. Yeah,
the idea that we are coalescing into even larger identity-based blocks. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, I mean, like, this is something that I think that you had groups. I mean, even I think you could argue Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference kind of echoed that like America and Europe, while vastly different, are still very much related to one another in terms of a shared history, the Enlightenment, the culture, the languages, and the fact that they've shared so much together. You can maybe disagree with that. You may not like his take for a variety of reasons, like fair enough. But also at the same time, like for Huntington, it was also like the clashes of, say, like the Muslim world as a broad term. That's not going away. Like we're not, we're still going to fight wars with these people. We're still going to be dealing with the consequences of our, like, the war with the Barbary states and we're still dealing with the fact that America or like the Western world or Europe may not necessarily be as Christian as it used to be, and who knows, we might enter like a survive the Jai future, and it's just going to be like a very pagan Europe. Okay. But like then you have the question of, okay, what does that look like when we're still fighting the Mohammedans? Like that's still not going away, obviously.
Yeah. So I need to address a couple of comments here. One is by one of our favorites, Sex Freakman, I was bringing up the scientific revolution.
He's a great guy.
I think the scientific revolution is a red herring in the sense of a cause. It's what people use to justify the changes they wanted to make anyway. So do we want to take that at face value? Well, I mean, what the scientific revolution describes was a pivot point where we can tell, just like the Enlightenment, we can prove that the Enlightenment, you can call it whatever you want, but that era of intellectual development happened between these years, and we have letters that prove it. Basically, we have the established network of how it happened. So the scientific revolution, there was a pre-scientific revolution where after that people became very interested in scientific research, dissecting things, understanding nature. And that's there was a period, a very specific period, where European adventurers became interested in the pyramids, and the people in Egypt did not give two shits about the pyramids. Something happened right around this time where they said, let's discover all that is undiscovered. Let's figure out how everything worked. And of course, you can find the precursors to that leading into it. But there was, just like the Renaissance, there was this moment where a lot of different things converged, and there was a mind revolution. And even Paul Hazard gets into this. If you look at, there's this great classic book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which we covered on Blood Satellite many episodes ago.
No, Thomas A. Kuhn. Yeah. Every introduction into research class in college has to make you read that book.
Yeah, but it's like I don't think it's wrong. But he talks about like, here's what it is. Here.
No, I don't either.
And because you can prove this happened because there's actually intense debate around these times. You have it's not just one person shows up with a bright idea. It's like there's like pre-Einstein and post-Einstein. Einstein was just one of many people working on the theory of relativity at the time, and they're sort of competing against each other. But we know when they started and when that reached its endpoint. Similarly, you can very, very distinctly bookend these sorts of things. So it's like it's not just a fiction they invented to cover up political motivations. It actually is a period in time where these things happened and they caused other things to happen. And so that's, I don't
how much of that you can say is objective for today is a different story. Because I mean, like, there's a lot of gay science, no pun intended, that just is like, well, did you know that eating red meat and having the same diet as everyone else for the last like 1,000 years is bad? And I mean, like, that's obviously a fair point to address a response to, but I mean, we did radically change our understanding of how the world operated. I mean, read any, I want to say pre-scientific, let's say 1400s medical textbook, or discussions about, well, where is like the health or whatnot. Even in like Christian literature, you had people who would be considered physicians talk about the nature of like man and his soul, and they would relate it to health. St. Gregory of Nyssa is a really good example of this. And then he starts talking about like the spleen being this like really important thing in regards to just like like some things that we would describe as like autonomic functions, and you're like, wait a second, what? And also like the 19th century also radicalizes this too, because then we get the growth in both the Netherlands, England, France, and the United States, all fighting over ether, general anesthesia, the ability to procure bodies, and of course that's where you get the famous like Burke and Hare murders too in the early 19th century. And so like there's validity to, of course, these claims, because they do radically understand our perception and conception of the self, the world, and then also at the same time our ability to make sense of who we are and what does that mean for our society. And I think that it gets so often I think it's underappreciated that the world that we're in is still predicated on so many of these advances that caused great levels of, like, well, what does that really mean for us in our place in the world? Like, of course, like, quantum physics does that in the early 20th century, but even then, the understanding of like the human body certainly does it too for where we're at. And I think that that's something that we don't really consider, we take for granted sometimes, is just how massive the world as we know it changed in the perception of the self.
Yeah, yeah, and like all these things are intermingled, and I guess that's what we're sort of deviating from the book here. But I mean, you can connect this book to books I'm sure we've covered in the past.
Well, you can, and I mean, this is why the first like 300 pages are really interesting, because it's almost as if someone brought more literature, historiographic, primary source as well as secondary source literature, and updated the first volume of Decline of the West, Form and Actuality, because this covers everything from numbers, time, calendar, religion, ethnicity, politics, nationalism, the identification as such into both pre-modern to the early modern period into the 19th century. And it's just like it's a really good companion piece in a lot of ways, which I greatly appreciate.
Yeah, and
so you really can go anywhere, and the book covers so much of what we have already talked about in other episodes. And so it's just like, you could spend hours on just like one or two sections and allow it to just, like we've been doing, let the conversation go anywhere.
Yeah, it's like what we covered in Christianity and classical culture about, I keep using this term mind revolution, but I should find a different term for it, but it's sort of a increased awareness or a capacity to think more abstractly. And I'm not saying that it's just an unbroken chain of these things, because I don't believe in the linearity of progress in any stretch. But there does seem to be these fits and starts and these demands placed upon, we place upon ourselves, and we have a deeper understanding of ourselves. And there's this part here that I wanted to make sure I got to. I skipped over it before, but it sounds like we're kind of getting back to it now. It says, just to address the scientific revolution thing and how we can see, and as you were saying, the popularity of ether and things like that, and to demarcate when sort of a rising medical awareness is occurring. He says, a bygone age lives on in revivals, archives, and myth. Today, the 19th century has vitality, where its culture is staged and consumed. Its characteristic aesthetic form in Europe, the opera, is a good example of such revival. The European opera came into being around 1600 in Italy, only decades after the rise of urban music theater in southern China, which marked the beginning of a development wholly independent of European influence that would reach its peak after 1790 with what we know today as the Beijing opera. Opera underwent globalization early on. In the mid-1800s, it had a clear radial point, Paris. Around 1830, Parisian musical history was global music history. By the 1830s, European operas were already being performed in the Ottoman Empire. Similar points might be made about dramatic theater, or another typical genre of time, the novel, as a separation of the living from the dead in 19th century high culture, is possible in many countries. So you start to see, like, you can tell through the spread of these art forms when they begin to become globalized, when there appears to be a center of gravity, like you said, the radial point of Paris, and that popularity of something seems to clearly spread from one area within a very well-defined, like 10 to 15 year period. And maybe you can only really start to do that within the modern age, because again, we are so obsessed with data records and accounting for information. Some of the stuff might have been lost through time, but beginning, I think, probably in the 18th century and before, but you really start seeing that we know exactly when and where these things happened. I think that's also relevant.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Like, there's a certain point in time where it's like, okay, we know where this idea has an origin point, because again, because of previous centuries, we now have a pretty detailed library or system of how like this thought process was cataloged. Or like we do know that there's like cross political contamination of ideas that maybe we didn't consider were actually in contact with one another because of modern academic discourse or whatever. But I mean, it really does kind of come to show that these revolutions did take place in a way that maybe we don't consider. And it's also something too that I thought was interesting is that so often because of say the boogeyman of colonialism, we talk about like disease, and the author spends a good chunk of change really explaining to you like this is the last point in time when you can destroy whole swaths of populations because of disease in uncontacted peoples, and the whole idea of like protecting the uncontacted doesn't really become a thing until much later, because again, there's the germ theory is only beginning to take off, and then at the same time, like this is the last point in time when like this is really going to be able to take place because now the world is so globalized. Populations that either have the ability to survive it will, and then the population becomes much more globalized. Now we start talking and we're framing ourselves in the lens of global health. And again, a lot of these things change.
It's so interesting, and we'll just end on this, seeing, I'll call it the normalized reaction against globalization, because let's say that it begins in earnest in the 19th century, but I think it takes until maybe the 21st century before you start to see a true pushback against it. And that used to be the purview of conspiracy cranks, such as myself and Alex Jones and whatnot. But now that's what everyone's talking about. And that's what causes so many people on our side to distance ourselves from it, because regulars are doing it right now, right? That's not cool to talk about being against globalization.
Well, and I think that's also a lot due to just like there's a media market as well. It's like, oh man, I got to get better material. No one wants to be the crow on the stand where they're getting yelled at because they have a recycled take or a normie take. But I mean, even when you read Marx himself, like the primary sources, you kind of understand and you can see there's a petty reaction, a petty reactionary take to the Industrial Revolution and globalization, because it's like, well, we can see actually the consequences of these things, and the consequences of globalization, of course, has been deracination, the flattening of the human being to just a disposable worker, and then at the same time, like we need to be going after those that are responsible, but but also requires them to attack other things that would be used as a form of social control. So for Marx, that might be religion and and other things. So I'm not saying Marx is correct about everything, but like you can see why Sam Francis is borrowing a lot from Marx when it comes to the question of the consequences of globalization, trade, international finance, and the rest. And I see why that comes up, because it's like, oh, well, now you're talking about like, well, I don't want to be like that guy. And it's like, well, that's fair. No one wants to be like the next guy. But it also at the same time, like we have to consider the fact that these issues are, they're not going away. They've been talked about for forever.
It's interesting.
And the consequences thereof.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Marx doesn't come up much in this book, does he?
No, he surprisingly does not. Marx himself does not come up, but the revolutions of socialism do.
Yeah, like I think there was a concerted effort.
Marxism has his own section. It's just not as large as I thought it would be.
Yeah, there's and maybe some people disagree with this, but there seemed to be an interest in separating emergent class antagonism from Marx himself, or rather, he was just describing something he was seeing, but he was not enlightening people with his discovery of it. So he was just kind of
his solutions were what was more being discussed.
Yeah, because I remember when I read Marx, I liked Volume 1 more than the one written by Engels, but like him assessing what capitalism is and how it works. I think there's still some utility in that, but there was this. I'm not trying to use the word emergent. I keep using that this episode, but there's like an assessment of this economic function that might not have been clearly visible, and that was brought into sharp relief through automation. And so much of this is a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and automation, which would lend to the idea that it is technology as the driver of ideology, and an ideology that perhaps even brings some people would put economics at the top, as I said, but I'm tempted. I'm putting economics below technology. I'm tempted to put it below ideology as well, just because ideology could be, you might even say, an illogical driver of human interest that its consequences are felt economically. I don't know. I'm not convinced of that. I just said it to say it. Anyway, we need to get going soon. We've been talking
It's a
for
thought
quite
to
some
put
time.
out into the ether for sure. And I mean,
It as true now as when it was just said.
that's true. So true. In fact, it might be true now. It might be true tomorrow. It might be true forever.
Now,
You never know.
Any
That's the best
closing
part.
thoughts?
I'm a sucker for books that are very, I think, meta in their commentary. And I think when you're talking about a history book, you have to be very realistic in how you're assessing history. And while, you may not agree with the author's politics, I think that what we have here is a pretty in-depth discussion about what does it mean to look at how the world has been radically altered by the 19th century. Because we still, as we said at the beginning of the text, and as the author himself makes very clear, we still live in the shadow of the 19th century. And our language, our institutions are fundamentally framed in that world. Yeah, even if we don't want to admit it, or even if we don't acknowledge it, it's just a world that we still live in. And it's been radically changed and altered due to our politics, our demographics of the world and its understanding. But also at the end of the day, like, we're in a position to now kind of begin to look back and make sense of that world. And with that, I think that that's particularly interesting. I don't want to tie it back to, I try not to tie everything back to work I've previously done, but the show really does build off of itself. When we talked about conceptual history, it's like the question is like, well, what the hell is the 19th century? And it's just like, well, we kind of get an answer now with that, with this book. We get an answer as to, well, what is the 19th century? What did that mean on a global scale and not just Europe? And I think that, this book so far has been a really good read. I'm on like page 700 something. We're going to finish it in part 2. We might do a part 3. We probably will, I'll be perfectly honest with you. But, in an interview I had a couple of years ago with Andrew McLuhan, I asked him about AI, and he's just like, we've barely comprehended the impact of the television. We're never going to be able to comprehend the impact on AI, not in my lifetime and not in yours. And so I think that, it's kind of prominent that we haven't, and we probably won't really comprehend the 19th century until, I think, as I had said at the beginning, the politics of the 21st are written.
Yeah, I think that's what people miss about Marshall McLuhan. And I think
this is why you should read him as a deeply reactionary person, because when he talks about Orientalization, and he refers specifically then also to like the way in which Western man's language, politics, and culture and religion will all change in the face of like this globalizing system through mass media and the digital age, there is a great degree of that being said with Lamentation. And that is a very reactionary way to look at the world.
I think Marshall McLuhan,
I think that should be considered.
Was cursed because I think he got too popular, maybe not too fast, but certainly too popular, and too many people misquoted him or misunderstood him. You hear people talk about the global village, but it'll be the complete 180-degree inversion of how he meant it, or the medium is the message. I've heard absolute fucking pinheads trying to describe what that is, and like they get it wrong. They don't have the depth of the idea that he was trying to express. And when you get into technological, what he calls auto amputation and extended senses and things like that, it gets into some really trippy, interesting stuff, especially for the time. And he was engaging in public debates over this stuff as well. I think he was a great public speaker as well. I think he's an underappreciated thinker because he's a misunderstood thinker. There's too many fucking retards.
And I think a lot of people were like, oh, when you read him, it's the sign of a midwit. No, it's not. Otherwise, he would be more widely understood. It's like when people fuck up Karl Popper.
Yeah, I made a claim that is pretty incisive, but I said Marshall McLuhan is the philosopher that everyone thinks Nick Land is, but isn't really. And maybe we'll just leave it at that. We'll leave people. We'll be back at the. We're going to be back. I think we agreed on April 20th to probably do a part 2. We might record a part 3 separately. I'm going to be in Chicago at the end of April. I will be scouting out some places because Dimes and I would like to do You Even Read Live? Oh, yeah. And it'll be closer to the end of the year because we have a couple other events lined up throughout the year. I have one coming up in April. But
I'm speaking at 2 different events this year besides Dyer Live.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like the Dyer thing, it's like that one I hope is just going to be fun. I'm hoping
I just want, I have no other... I have no other desire for that than just to be entertaining for you guys in person. It'd be fun to meet Sex Freakman in person.
Yeah, it's going to be more time spent considering how to make it fun and interesting and make it into a more engaging show. Do we want to bring other... Like, do we hand a mic to... Like, how do we capture the super chat experience? Do we encourage people to just...
They throw dollar bills at us, and we talk to them.
Yeah, it's going to be
your super chats will be evaluated by the quality of the drinks you buy us.
Someone here says Thomas 777 territory. I mean, obviously, I'm going to try and get him out. Obviously, I'm going to try and integrate him.
He'll stop by.
Oh, I want to pay him.
I've had drinks with him. We'll make that happen.
I'll pay him cold hard cash to see if he wants to fucking MC. I want to get him in the crowd. I want to get him fighting people. I want him to be cussing people. I don't know what I want. I want him setting off fireworks. There's gonna be something cool happening, and I'm gonna figure out what number it takes to get that to happen. Someone had said earlier in the chat, like, shots fired at Thomas 777. I had no idea what that was referring to.
No, heavens, no.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you said survive the.
I'm like I've broken bread with the man. I don't really have anything bad to say. Although we did get a super chat earlier from Entropy. Charlie Mackey sends a very generous $25. He says, "Good evening, gentlemen. I hope you are both well." The same to you, Mr. Mackey. I hope that you're well.
Keep in mind, none of us are admitting that we are well. We are just hoping that each other are well.
Yeah, we just wish that for each other.
It's just a bunch of guys wishing each other well and then politely avoiding the question.
And then politely bitching in group chats about how awful life is.
Awful life is, and then every so often I'm like, it doesn't take a lot to get guys like us to switch it up and get happy. Like I had a good crust on my sandwich today. Life, we're gonna make it. They'll pull us
the new coffee place by my office is actually really nice.
I was like, Kanye West dropped a new album, and it's okay. All right, let's give it another day. Let's see what happens tomorrow.
The guy who plays Severus Snape is black, which makes the adaptation all the more entertaining.
I cannot imagine living in a world where I care about Harry Potter. You know what I mean? It's
entertaining to me because it's just like we went from Alan Rickman to future, time cop who keeps pushing all these Korean people in front of a train.
Well, because do not the original Harry Potter movies still hold up?
Yeah.
Just in terms of the acting, the CGI, everything. Because from what I saw, production stills from it.
I
it looks
watched
exactly the same.
I watched Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, like the first one in the 2001. That has aged incredibly well for its effects. Like, yeah, you can tell we're CGI, but like Sam's using the darkness to his advantage, and it's just like, man, this is still really cheesy, but it's still really good.
I was watching old movies recently. I watched Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which I'd never seen before. And I saw The French Connection, which I'd also never seen before.
I have been recently going through all of the Jimmy Stewart Hitchcock movies. I rewatched Rear Window for the first time in years, and I forgot how fucking good it is.
Honestly, I know this is kind of hack film school 101 stuff, but I remember watching North by Northwest, and a lot of the Hitchcock movies, and again, basic bitch opinion, but I'm like, this is from an era where films looked like film. And as much as I might like a recent movie, I might like something like Weapons. I might like some, name one. There's still good movies being released, but everything is so dark. Everything is washed out. Nothing pops. Everything is so dreary. And then you watch these old movies, and it's just vibrant. It's engaging. It might not look like a documentary. It might not look as real. Why would there be light at night? Everything should be dark at night. But I don't desire that. Things like these movies looked so good, and the audio was so good, and they all hold up visually way more than people's prejudice would let them believe. But yeah, I've just been like, I was watching French
my
Connection.
normie, my basic bitch film opinion is that I would happily recommend Project Hail Mary to everybody. I'm sure I'm waiting for the reactionary chud film take to tell me it's bad. No, it's good. It was great. I enjoyed it. And I also read the book beforehand, which also made it all that more enjoyable for me. But for me, Ben-Hur is getting a small theatrical re-release in theaters right now, the 1959 one with Charlton Heston. I think just because it's the Pascal season. So I'm going to go see that this week. And I'm super excited for that.
I was such a square. I saw Lawrence of Arabia for the first time like last year.
That movie looks like $1 million.
And I looked around. I'm like, do people know how good this movie is? Do people know? Like it won. I think they invented the Academy Awards just to give them to Lawrence of Arabia.
It's the dude, just these people don't fucking know.
Well, this is like shot really well. This is like the acting is good. Like, what did I expect? Asshole.
My God, it's like Gone with the Wind, but better.
It's like I should watch Gone with the Wind. Wow. What the fuck? They're racist.
That needs to be a genre where it's like pretentious film student stoner, but like he actually goes and sees the films he's talking about.
I like the film stoner who's also racist and is surprised that they were racist in the past too.
Whoa!
Whoa!
He's literally me.
Well, you guys were racist too. I thought we had that.
I like how this is just Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, except it's just like they're racist.
Wow, is the past me? I thought I invented racism. Just what a cool guy to know.
Lord Balfour, dude.
A guy just walking around thinking he invented racism until he saw a couple of movies.
I'm thinking about that stupid tweet where he's just like, guy who's only seen Boss Babies. I'm getting real Boss Baby vibes from this, and it's just like film student stoner who's only seen The Triumph of the Will. I'm getting real Lenny Riefenstahl vibes from this.
All right,
everyone, we'll see you next time.
See you next